Beneath the cracked mud and shifting sands of Mesopotamia, archaeologists uncovered something no one expected: a civilization that seemed to appear without a childhood. No slow climb from tribe to town, no clumsy experiments with symbols or crude tools. Instead, Sumer rose fully formed, cities already planned, writing already complex, mathematics already precise, and laws already inscribed. Their merchants traded across thousands of miles. Their astronomers tracked the heavens. Their priests built temples that touched the sky. It is as though they carried forward the memory of a forgotten world. Why does the first civilization look less like a beginning and more like a return? And how did they transform marshland into the blueprint of all human society? Tonight, let us step into the ancient mysteries of Sumer, where each clay tablet whispers secrets that challenge modern science. We will not find final answers, but echoes. Fragments of stories buried for millennia, puzzles that refuse to be solved, and questions that linger in the silence of ruins. If you are ready, the story begins. The land between two rivers lies flat and endless, a vast expanse of marshland where reeds once whispered in the wind. Millennia ago, nothing suggested greatness would rise here. No stone mountains crowned the horizon, no forests spread across the plain, only mud, water, and the occasional shimmer of starlight reflecting on stagnant pools. And yet, from this improbable setting, something impossible emerged. The first true civilization, not in fragments or tentative experiments, but already formed, already complete, as if it had stepped fully grown from the mind of a god. Archaeologists call it Sumer, and they trace its emergence to around 3500 BC. Yet from the very beginning, Sumer confounds the logic of development. Instead of small farming villages slowly evolving into larger settlements, the ruins of cities like Uruk appear fully realized, walled with massive ramparts, filled with temples, surrounded by irrigation systems that turn deserts into gardens. Inside these cities, the world's earliest writing had already taken shape. Not crude pictures, but intricate cuneiform signs pressed into clay with a stylus. Science expects civilizations to climb a ladder, early scratches evolving into alphabets, crude huts evolving into towns. But the evidence suggests Sumer bypassed those steps. Imagine if a person appeared from nowhere, already literate, already educated, carrying tools for a world no one else had yet imagined. That is what Sumer looks like to historians, a civilization with no childhood. Consider the earliest tablets discovered in Uruk. They don't contain myths, prayers, or poetry. Instead, they record ledgers, numbers of cattle, jars of beer, allocations of grain. These aren't the halting experiments of a people just learning to write. They are the work of trained scribes, already fluent in accounting systems. How could a system so complex appear so suddenly? Science searches for missing links, earlier tablets, practice scratches in clay, but none have been found. It is as though the first page of human history is already written in the middle of a sentence. The same paradox extends to mathematics. Sumerian records reveal not mere counting but compound interest, fractional divisions, and calculations precise enough to predict eclipses. Elsewhere, societies were still tallying numbers on fingers or knots in string. Sumer began with sophistication. This is not to say we have no theories. Some scholars argue that Sumerians inherited fragments of older traditions, perhaps from farming cultures along the Persian Gulf, or even from now submerged lands drowned at the end of the Ice Age. Others suggest that the seeming suddenness is only because older evidence lies undiscovered, buried deep beneath silt or washed away by shifting rivers. But these explanations remain speculative, shadows trying to fill the vast gap between what science expects and what the ruins display. Picture Uruk at its peak, 40,000 people within its walls, a metropolis larger than any city would be again until the rise of Athens. Wide boulevards led to towering temples, and canals cut through neighborhoods like watery veins. From docks, boats carried goods that had traveled thousands of miles. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from the Indus Valley, cedar from Lebanon. The Sumerians were not stumbling towards civilization, they were already living it, and then as suddenly as they appeared, they vanished. By 2000 BC, the great cities were in decline, their libraries closed, their gods abandoned. For 4,000 years, the memory of Sumer faded so completely that when archaeologists first uncovered cuneiform tablets in the 1850s, no one even knew the name Sumer had ever existed. A civilization fundamental to everything we now take for granted, writing, law, urban life, had been erased from memory as though by design. It is this paradox that gives Sumer its haunting mystery. How can a culture so essential to the human story appear so suddenly and vanish so completely? Was it truly the first, or only the first we remember? And if the beginning was not really a beginning, what came before? The silence of the Mesopotamian plain leaves us no easy answer. Only broken tablets, dried mud bricks, and the echo of something that feels older than history itself. Next, we will trace this mystery into the medium that defined Sumer's existence, the invention of writing, or perhaps the inheritance of knowledge already known. In a museum case, under careful light, lies a fragment of clay pressed with rows of wedge-shaped signs. At first glance, they look like scratches, the idle doodles of someone passing time. Yet they are not idle at all. They are records, barley shipments, beer rations, temple inventories. This is Uruk IV, dated around 3200 BC, the world's first known writing. And what astonishes archaeologists is how fully developed it already is. We expect beginnings to be rough. When Egypt first experimented with hieroglyphs, pictures evolved slowly into words. When China scratched oracle bones, symbols grew gradually more complex. But the Sumerian system seems to skip its childhood. It emerges not as clumsy sketches, but as a complete system of signs, numbers, and conventions. These early tablets already distinguish commodities by grade, calculate quantities, and align with a sexagesimal mathematical base still with us in our clocks and compasses. There are no practice tablets, no crude attempts. It is as if writing itself stepped into the world already fluent. Archaeologists trace the story back further, into small clay tokens dating as far as 8000 BC. Farmers shaped little cones, spheres, and discs, each representing a good: a sheep, a jar of oil, a measure of grain. To confirm shipments, they sealed tokens inside clay envelopes called bullae. The tokens could be broken out later to verify delivery. Over time, merchants began pressing the tokens onto the surface of the clay rather than sealing them inside. The impressions became abstract. Abstract marks became standardized. And standardized marks became cuneiform. But even this chain leaves questions. The leap from tokens to tablets is vast. By the time the first records appear, the symbols are already far removed from pictures. They are arranged in grids, organized into rows, capable of representing both numbers and words. Where are the centuries of transition we should expect? Where are the mistakes, the abandoned experiments? None have been found. The trail begins midstream. Some scholars argue that earlier tablets may yet lie buried beneath deeper strata of Uruk or washed away by shifting rivers. Others suggest the climate of the southern marshes destroyed fragile records before they could fossilize. Yet the possibility remains that writing did not originate in Sumer at all, that it was inherited, preserved from an older world whose traces are now lost. Consider the sophistication of their earliest records. One tablet records rations for workers, not only listing quantities of grain, but also differentiating between adult and child, male and female. Another describes wages paid in beer, measured in precise daily allowances. Yet another calculates loans with compound interest, a concept so advanced it puzzles modern economists that it appears at civilization's birth. These are not trial runs. They are fluent applications of a system already trusted to govern life. The cultural impact of this system was immense. Writing transformed memory. No longer were transactions bound to fragile recall. A clay tablet could preserve a promise beyond a lifetime, carry a contract across cities, hold a hymn for centuries. The written word extended human thought beyond human memory, creating a shared mind that spanned generations. Imagine the temple precinct of Uruk at dusk. Merchants unload jars of oil and sacks of barley from reed boats. A scribe waits at a low table, stylus in hand. He presses wedge after wedge into clay, recording not only what has arrived, but also who owes what to whom. His marks are not decoration, they are authority. Without them, the shipment is not acknowledged. With them, debt becomes binding. He smooths the clay with water, dries it in the sun, and stacks it with dozens more tablets. Around him rise walls inscribed with myths, hymns, decrees. A city not only of bricks, but of words. It is striking that the world's first writing was not poetry but accounting. The Sumerians did not invent script to tell stories, but to manage complexity, to track grain, organize labor, administer surplus. Civilization itself demanded record-keeping. Yet within centuries, this administrative tool expanded. The same stylus that tallied barley also composed hymns to Inana, myths of creation, and the Epic of Gilgamesh. Invention had become literature, but was it invention? The completeness of Sumerian writing fuels speculation that it may reflect survival rather than innovation. Some propose that survivors of a forgotten flood or migration carried fragments of symbolic systems into Mesopotamia, planting seeds that blossomed suddenly in Uruk. Others point to myths themselves, which speak of the me, divine decrees of order and knowledge bestowed upon humankind by the gods. Could these myths preserve memory of knowledge not invented, but gifted? Science resists such leaps, yet the puzzle remains. Why does Sumerian writing appear with no visible prelude? Why do the earliest tablets show sophistication that should have taken centuries? Why does the world's first script look less like a beginning and more like a continuation? Writing did not only preserve memory, it created authority. Kings carved decrees into clay, priests inscribed rituals, merchants sealed contracts. To write was to bind reality. The spoken word could fade. The written word endured. In this sense, writing was power itself, a tool of gods and rulers. Standing in the galleries of modern museums, we can still read those words. We see grain tallies, beer rations, debt accounts, written by hands that lived 5,000 years ago. The immediacy is haunting. Across millennia, the Sumerians still speak. Yet their sudden fluency leaves us wondering who taught them to write, and whether they were truly the first. If the stylus appeared already sharp, the tablets already full, then perhaps knowledge itself had travelled invisible roads, carried from a time before time. And if so, what else did they inherit, besides words pressed into clay? At the edge of the Mesopotamian plain, where the Euphrates meets the sea, once stood docks crowded with boats carved from palm trunks, their reed sails catching the desert wind. 4,000 years ago, those harbours thrummed with activity. Barges unloaded silver from Anatolia, pearls from Bahrain, copper from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and carnelian beads from the Indus Valley. In the markets of Ur and Uruk, incense smoke mingled with voices speaking half a dozen tongues. Scribes, seated at low tables, pressed wedge-shaped marks into clay, recording each transaction with the precision of accountants. These were the arteries of the world's first global economy, a network that stretched across deserts and seas without the visible scaffolding of empire. What astonishes historians is not only the range of Sumer's trade, but the way it functioned. Most ancient long-distance exchange was secured through conquest. The Egyptians sent armies to guard mines in Sinai. The Assyrians, centuries later, built fortresses to protect caravan routes. Rome would deploy legions to keep Mediterranean trade flowing, but Sumer left behind no evidence of colonies, imperial garrisons, or naval patrols. Their caravans crossed hostile lands, their ships braved pirate-infested waters, and yet for over a millennium, the goods kept moving. How? Through what we might call invisible roads, networks of trust, shared standards, and written contracts that bound strangers together more effectively than swords. The clay tablets tell the story. One from Ur records a shipment of lapis, weighed by Sumerian standards, exchanged for silver at a fixed rate. Another lists trade agreements with Dilmun, modern Bahrain, suggesting goods could move between cities separated by hundreds of miles of sea and desert, with contracts honoured at both ends. Cylinder seals carved with intricate designs served as personal signatures. Pressed into clay, they guaranteed that a shipment or agreement carried the authority of the seal's owner, recognizable from Mesopotamia to the Persian Gulf. Archaeology provides physical confirmation. In the ruins of Sumer, seals carved in the style of the Indus Valley have been unearthed, evidence of Harappan merchants living and working among Sumerians. Conversely, Sumerian seals have been discovered in sites as distant as Pakistan and Afghanistan. This was not sporadic exchange, but sustained contact, an economy operating across continents before iron tools, before coinage, before empires. Imagine the scene at the covered market of Ur around 2500 BC. Merchants from distant lands crowd the stalls. An Indus trader displaying beads of deep red carnelian. A caravan leader offering obsidian blades sharp as glass. An Arabian sailor laying out baskets of frankincense. Translators move between groups, converting Sumerian grain measures into Harappan weight standards. Scribes sit cross-legged at the edges, recording values, inscribing ledgers that could be honoured thousands of miles away. Above them all, the Ziggurat looms, its terraces shimmering in the desert heat, a reminder that commerce was not just exchange but sacred order. This system puzzles modern scholars because it resembles, in so many ways, our own. The Sumerians created letters of credit, promises written in clay that could be redeemed elsewhere. They standardized measures so rigorously that merchants from Anatolia to the Indus could trust transactions. They developed merchant guilds that settled disputes and guaranteed contracts. These are the fundamentals of global trade, appearing not gradually, but in full at the very dawn of history. And yet, no empire enforced them. What bound strangers together was the shared belief in symbols, in seals pressed into clay, in numbers written on tablets, in gods invoked as witnesses to agreements. Trust itself became infrastructure, as durable as any stone road. Even their myths echo the importance of faraway resources. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero journeys to the cedar forest of Lebanon, seeking wood strong enough to build Uruk's gates and temples. The story tells of violence. Gilgamesh and Enkidu slay Humbaba, the guardian set there by the gods, but beneath the drama lies something telling. The very choice of cedar as his prize reflects how deeply Sumerians valued materials from distant lands, materials they could not grow or harvest at home. Whether through trade or mythic conquest, the cedar forest symbolized the lure of distant wealth and the networks that brought exotic goods into Mesopotamia. The invisible roads endured because they benefited all who walked them. A caravan raider might profit once, but a trusted route profited for generations. Mutual reliance created stability. In this sense, Sumer anticipated the logic of globalization thousands of years before the term existed. Consider the implications. When modern cargo ships dock in ports across oceans, when banks transfer credits in seconds between continents, they echo the same principles. A shipment of lapis lazuli in 2500 BC relied on the same foundation as a container of electronics today. Trust in a contract, faith in a system of exchange. The invisible roads of Sumer are still beneath our feet. But this raises unsettling questions. How did the Sumerians, the first to build cities, also build a system of commerce so advanced it rivals our own? Did they invent it themselves, or inherit fragments of an older, forgotten order of trade? Why do their invisible networks appear as fully formed as their writing, their cities, their laws? In the hum of Ur's marketplace, in the scratch of stylus across clay, We hear the echo of something older than memory, a system too complete to feel like a beginning. And just as their merchants carried goods across unseen roads, so too did their smiths work fire and ore with a mastery that shows no apprenticeship, no fumbling steps, only perfection from the start. In the galleries of the British Museum sits an object small enough to hold in one hand, yet heavy with a question science cannot answer. It is a bronze dagger from ancient Sumer, its blade still sharp after more than 4 millennia, its copper and tin alloyed in the precise 90:10 ratio metallurgists today consider optimal for strength. The handle is inlaid with lapis lazuli and shell, its balance so fine that it looks machine-made. When archaeologists study this dagger, what troubles them most is not its elegance but its context. There is no evidence of mistakes, no trail of failed experiments, no crude prototypes leading to perfection. Most civilizations leave behind their learning curve. In Egypt, early copper chisels are brittle, gradually replaced by stronger alloys as centuries pass. In Anatolia, slag heaps reveal generations of failed smelts, ore burned at the wrong temperatures, molds cracked by poor casting. But in Sumer, metallurgy seems to appear fully formed. The earliest artifacts already show mastery of two-part mold casting, lost wax techniques, work hardening by hammering, and annealing to relieve stress. Their workshops contained furnaces capable of reaching over 1,000 liang, hot enough to smelt copper and alloy it with tin, a delicate process even with modern equipment. Archaeological evidence underscores this enigma. At sites like Ur, Uruk, and Eridu, excavators have found not just copper trinkets but standardized bronze tools, axes, sickles, chisels, spearheads. They are symmetrical, carefully cast, and durable. The same workshops also produced decorative pieces of gold and silver with a refinement that suggests long traditions of skill. Yet those traditions remain invisible in the ground. We see only the finished products, as though the centuries of experimentation that should have preceded them were erased. Where did the knowledge come from? Some historians argue that Sumer's metallurgy was imported. Tin, essential for bronze, does not exist in Mesopotamia. Geological surveys confirm that the nearest sources lie in the Zagros Mountains, Iran, and as far away as Afghanistan. This implies that Sumer's metallurgists not only mastered alloying, but also sustained long-distance trade to secure rare materials. To maintain consistent supplies of tin and copper suggests organization, foresight, and knowledge networks extending well beyond Mesopotamia. Texts from later Mesopotamian periods describe smiths as figures of awe, almost semi-divine. The god Enki was credited with bestowing the secrets of metalwork upon humanity. In myths, metal itself was described as possessing life and power. Bronze was not only a material, it was a gift, a transformation of base matter into something enduring, proof that humans could harness the hidden fire of the earth. The Kassite metallurgy god, Ninagal, though worshipped in later centuries, reflects a tradition stretching back to Sumer. Smiths were not mere craftsmen, but custodians of sacred knowledge. Consider the workshop in Ur, around 2600 BC. Clay bellows pump air into a glowing furnace, flames rising higher as ore turns molten. The heat is overwhelming, sparks dancing in the darkened chamber. A smith, hands steady, pours the liquid metal into a clay mold carved with intricate design. Hours later, the mold is broken, revealing a weapon or vessel, shining as if born of fire itself. There are no piles of rejected attempts nearby, no half-finished experiments, only finished pieces, each one flawless, as if knowledge itself had descended whole. Sumerian metallurgy extended beyond weapons. Jewelry discovered in royal tombs dazzles with complexity. Gold headdresses woven with thousands of tiny leaves, silver cups so thin and regular they could pass for modern machining. Queen Puabi's burial chamber alone contained a wealth of metal objects whose craftsmanship modern artisans still struggle to replicate without advanced tools. These finds are not isolated luxuries, but part of a broader pattern. From the start, Sumerian artisans worked as if inheriting traditions, not inventing them anew. Science offers cautious explanations. Perhaps experimentation did occur, but earlier sites remain buried beneath river silt, yet to be uncovered. Perhaps the perfection we see was achieved not in Sumer itself, but imported from neighbours who had longer histories of metal use. The Iranian Plateau, Anatolia, and Central Asia all contain evidence of prehistoric smelting experiments. Yet even if true, the puzzle remains. Why do Sumer's earliest artifacts show no rough edges, no sign of gradual mastery within their own heartland? The question deepens when we consider the infrastructure metallurgy demands. Smelting furnaces require specialized architecture, constant fuel, and precise timing. To sustain production on a city scale meant organizing woodcutters to feed fires, miners to extract ores, caravans to transport ingots, smiths to craft, and administrators to record. This was an industrial chain, not an isolated experiment. It implies that metallurgy in Sumer was not a fragile invention, but a mature system integrated into the entire economy. There is another layer. Metallurgy changed society itself. Bronze sickles allowed larger harvests, bronze chisels cut stronger timber for construction, bronze weapons shifted the balance of power in warfare. With metal, Sumer built its temples, defended its cities, and adorned its dead. The sudden presence of such transformative tools, without visible prelude, reinforces the sense that Sumer was less a beginning than an inheritance. And yet, we must be cautious. There is no evidence of lost machines or technology out of place for its time. Sumerian metalwork, though astonishingly advanced, remains within the range of Bronze Age possibility. The mystery lies not in impossibility, but in timing, in how the first civilization already possessed skills that should have required generations of accumulation. The impression is of a culture that stepped onto the stage already armed with knowledge. Knowledge perhaps carried by migrants from older, less visible traditions, or preserved orally for centuries before finally taking shape in clay and fire. But for now, the archaeological record shows only mastery, not apprenticeship. So we are left with a paradox. The first civilization, whose cities rose from marshland, whose writing appeared fully formed, also wielded fire and ore with unerring skill. Was it pure genius born of necessity, or echoes of a deeper past now erased? The answer may lie in the very monuments that still stand above the plains. The Ziggurats, immense stairways of brick rising toward the sky, constructed with the same precision and mystery as the daggers and jewels. Like metallurgy, they too defy easy explanation. From the empty flatlands of southern Mesopotamia rises a shape that should not be there, a mountain of brick. The great ziggurat of Ur, begun under King Ur-Nammu around 2100 BC, still looms above the plain. Tier upon tier of mud brick, faced with fired bricks set in bitumen, it climbs toward the sky in measured steps. Even in ruin, its sheer mass commands awe. It is not hollow like a temple, not sealed like a tomb, but solid through and through, an artificial mountain with no obvious function except to exist as a stairway between worlds. Science sees in it one of the earliest monumental structures in human history, yet the purpose remains elusive. Unlike the Egyptian pyramids, ziggurats were not tombs. Unlike Greek temples, they were not gathering places for worshippers. At the summit stood a small shrine, but the vast bulk beneath supported nothing more than an empty platform. To modern eyes, it seems an extravagant waste of labour. But to the Sumerians, the ziggurat was the cosmic axis, the place where heaven touched earth. The word itself may come from zikuratu, to rise high. Contemporary hymns describe ziggurats as bond between heaven and earth, mountain house, or navel of the world. In a land of marshes and deserts, without natural mountains, the Sumerians built their own. To climb a ziggurat was to ascend into the divine realm, to stand closer to the gods. It was not a building for human use, but a stage for cosmic drama. Archaeological evidence reveals how carefully these mountains of meaning were engineered. The Great Ziggurat of Ur measured roughly 64 by 45 meters at its base and may have risen over 30 meters high. Its bricks were set with reed mats and bitumen mortar to absorb rain and heat. Drains and weep holes carried away water to prevent collapse. Foundation deposits, clay cones, figurines, inscriptions were buried deep in its core, dedicating the structure to Inana, the moon god. Every feature was deliberate. The ziggurat was not only an offering to the divine, but also an assertion of permanence in a landscape where mud brick houses crumbled within decades. The labour required was immense. Tens of thousands of bricks, each inscribed with the king's name, were stacked by teams of workers under the desert sun. Unlike pyramids, which were built from stone quarries, Sumerians had only clay. They fired it, dried it, strengthened it with bitumen. A single large ziggurat might consume millions of bricks. The decision to pour so much energy into something with no clear practical function speaks volumes. The purpose was not utility, but symbolism. Picture the city of Ur in its prime. Canals crisscross neighbourhoods of reed houses and workshops. Merchants crowd the markets, scribes tally goods in clay. And above it all, the ziggurat towers, visible for miles, its terraces painted in colours, black at the base, red in the middle, blue at the top. At sunset the staircases glow as though the mountain itself were aflame. Every eye in the city could see it, every life revolved around it. For the citizens of Ur, the ziggurat was not background, it was the horizon, the axis of existence. What happened at its summit remains debated. Archaeologists found evidence of a small temple, perhaps housing the god's image, tended by priests and priestesses. Rituals may have been performed at dawn or dusk, sacrifices offered, prayers recited. But the structure was too steep and narrow for mass gatherings. Worshippers likely remained below, watching the figures ascend. The spectacle itself, priests silhouetted against the sky, moving higher with each step, was the ritual. The ziggurat transformed human figures into divine intermediaries simply by elevating them above the crowd. Some scholars argue that ziggurats also had astronomical functions. Their elevated platforms offered unobstructed views of the horizon, ideal for observing star risings that regulated the agricultural calendar. The 7 stages of some ziggurats may have symbolized the 7 heavens or the 7 planetary bodies known to the ancients. But no clear instruments or markings have been found to prove this. The connection between ziggurats and the stars remains tantalizing but unresolved. Others see them as political monuments. By inscribing every brick with his name, a king asserted his legacy in material form. Unlike palaces that crumbled, the ziggurat would endure, reminding generations of his reign. Authority was built into the skyline. In this sense, the ziggurat was propaganda as much as it was sacred space. A proclamation in mud and fire that kingship was sanctioned by the gods. And yet the ziggurat's power was not only political, it was psychological. In the flat Mesopotamian plain, height itself was sacred. To climb above the earth was to stand closer to eternity. Even today, to stand on the surviving terraces of Ur's ziggurat is to feel that pull, the strange vertigo of looking across the desert from a height where no hill should exist. Ziggurats became a recurring motif across Mesopotamia. Ur, Uruk, Eridu, Nippur. Each city had its own, dedicated to its patron god, rising above its skyline. Later cultures remembered them too. The biblical Tower of Babel may have been inspired by Babylon's ziggurat, the Etemenanki, whose name meant house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Even in myth, the ziggurat remained a symbol of human ambition to reach the divine. And yet, all are now ruins. Their bright plaster is gone, their terraces eroded, their shrines lost. What remains are jagged mounds of mud brick, half buried in dust, but even in decay, they speak. They remind us that Sumer built not for shelter, not for storage, but for meaning. They created mountains where none existed, bridges that linked earth to sky, monuments that outlasted their makers. The ziggurat challenges science because it resists simple explanation. Was it temple, observatory, throne, or symbol? Perhaps it was all of these at once. Perhaps it was a structure that functioned less as building and more as ritual technology, an engine of belief, a machine that generated awe. Its meaning may never be fully known, but its presence endures, a silent giant in the desert. And as these mountains of brick defined the sacred skyline, so too did the tombs beneath the earth reveal another dimension of Sumerian power. The strange, haunting spectacle of rulers buried with their entire courts. Death transformed into ceremony. In the 1920s, British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley led an excavation at the site of Ur, one of Sumer's greatest cities. What he uncovered beneath the desert shocked the world. Beneath layers of collapsed mud brick, Woolley and his team unearthed the royal cemetery of Ur, a burial ground dating to around 2600 BC. Among hundreds of graves were 16 extraordinary tombs, lavishly built, filled with treasures of gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and carnelian. Yet the wealth was not what seized attention. It was the bodies, dozens of them, arranged in careful rows beside their rulers. The most famous is the tomb of Queen Puabi. Her burial chamber contained an extraordinary headdress of gold leaves and lapis beads, combs of gold, and a lyre decorated with a golden bull's head. But just outside her chamber lay what Woolley called the death pit. Here, 74 attendants were discovered, women wearing elaborate jewellery, guards holding weapons, musicians lying beside their instruments. They were not scattered in chaos. They were arranged in rows, reclining as though in calm sleep, their positions deliberate, their faces serene. It was as if Puabi's entire household had stepped into death with her, a court preserved in silence for eternity. At first Woolley believed they had gone willingly, drinking a potion to join their mistress in the afterlife. Forensic evidence seemed to support this. Traces of a white substance in vessels near the bodies, the absence of violent trauma on many skeletons. Later re-examination, however, revealed more disturbing signs. Some skulls bore fractures consistent with blunt force trauma, suggesting execution rather than voluntary sacrifice. Others may indeed have ingested soporific poisons before being arranged in place. The truth remains unresolved. Did these attendants volunteer, or were they compelled? What is certain is the spectacle of power these burials represent. The tombs were not merely graves. They were theatre, stage scenes meant to impress both the living and the dead. Lyres were placed as if ready for song. Chariots stood harnessed to oxen. Guards gripped spears in eternal vigilance. Death was choreographed to look like life, frozen at the moment of service. The scale of these rituals staggers the imagination. Each royal burial consumed the lives of dozens, sometimes over 100 attendants, alongside massive amounts of treasure. For Puabi alone, archaeologists recovered over 2 pounds of hammered gold, more than 60 carnelian beads, and intricate ornaments of electrum. To bury so much wealth and so many lives suggests not only devotion, but also the capacity of rulers to command absolute obedience. Royalty in Sumer was not symbolic. It was a power that extended beyond life, binding others even into death. And yet, the rituals did not last forever. By later periods, Sumerian kings were buried with far fewer attendants, and the practice of mass sacrifice seems to have faded. Perhaps it was unsustainable, too costly in lives and resources. Perhaps cultural attitudes shifted, with later rulers seeking immortality in inscriptions and monuments rather than through lavish death pits. But for a brief window in early Sumerian history, the line between ruler and divinity was reinforced by ceremonies that consumed entire households. Imagine the day of Puabi's funeral. The queen's body, adorned in gold and lapis, lies on a bier. Attendants drink from cups or kneel as priests approach. Musicians strum their lyres one last time before silence falls. Then perhaps a blow to the head, or the slow drift of poison through their veins. They are arranged with care, robes smoothed, jewelry set just so. Torches flicker as earth is piled above, sealing the scene in eternal darkness. Centuries later, when Woolley uncovered it, the arrangement still spoke, not of violence in the moment, but of obedience that endured into eternity. The psychological weight of these burials cannot be overstated. They broadcast a message to the living. The king or queen was not merely a human ruler, but a figure whose authority transcended life. To defy such power was unthinkable, for it reached even into death. The death pits were not only about the dead, they were a form of propaganda for those still alive, reminders carved into collective memory that obedience to the throne was eternal. Science wrestles with these findings because they resist easy categorization. Were they acts of devotion, driven by belief that service in the afterlife was an honor, or acts of coercion, proof of absolute political control? The archaeological record offers clues but no certainty. Jewelry in perfect order suggests ritual, not violence. Skull fractures suggest execution. The truth may be both, ritualized killing framed as sacred sacrifice. What remains undeniable is the haunting impression left by these pits. The golden lyres, though their strings have long since decayed, still stand, their bull-headed decorations staring with blank eyes. The impressions of bodies linger in the soil, ghostly outlines of people whose lives ended in obedience. The silence of those chambers speaks more loudly than words. Here lay a society where royal power commanded even death itself. Later cultures would remember Sumerian kings as semi-divine, chosen by the gods. The royal cemetery shows how deeply that belief shaped reality. In Sumer, to be royal was to be absolute. The ruler's passage to the underworld was not solitary but accompanied, reinforced by attendance, wealth, and spectacle. Death became a continuation of court life, staged with the same grandeur as life above. But power could reshape more than death. In the temples of Inana, authority reached into identity itself, dissolving even the boundaries of gender in service to divine drama. In the heart of Uruk, the sacred city of the goddess Inanna, festivals filled the air with music and incense. Crowds gathered in temple courtyards to witness rituals that blurred the boundary between human and divine. Among the priests and priestesses moved figures who did not fit the ordinary categories of society. They were the Gala, the Kurgaru, and the Asinnu, ritual specialists who embodied identities outside the binary of male and female. They were the gender-neutral servants of Inanna, the goddess who herself embodied contradiction, love and war, fertility and destruction, chaos and order. These roles were not hidden at the margins. They were honored within the temple hierarchy. Texts from the early dynastic and old Babylonian periods describe the Gala priests as temple musicians and lamenters. They sang dirges in Sumerian for Inanna's rituals, especially during funerary rites or ceremonies of mourning. Their songs survive on clay tablets, written in cuneiform with notations of rhythm and structure. Some lamentations even bear the mark of their distinctive speech patterns. Scholars believe the Gala may have used a form of Sumerian with feminine grammatical endings, a linguistic performance that blurred gender through language itself. The Kurgaru and Asinnu appear in myths like Inanna's descent to the underworld. When Inanna is trapped in the realm of the dead, it is not warriors or kings who rescue her, but beings neither male nor female. Created by the god Enki, they slip through the gates of the underworld unnoticed because they defy categorization. Carrying the food and water of life, they revive Inanna and restore her to the living world. This mythic role mirrors their ritual role. Intermediaries who could cross boundaries ordinary humans could not. Mediators between male and female, life and death, sacred and profane. Archaeological evidence hints at their presence in daily life. Administrative tablets record Gala priests receiving temple rations, owning property, and even engaging in business contracts. They were salaried professionals, not outcasts. They lived within the economic and social systems of the city, their roles recognized and formalized. This integration challenges modern assumptions that ancient societies were rigidly binary in gender roles. In Sumer, more than 4,000 years ago, there was institutional space for identities that existed between. The myths reinforce this acceptance. In hymns, Inanna is described as a goddess who turns a man into a woman and a woman into a man, a divine power that destabilizes and transforms. Her servants reflected this chaos and fluidity, embodying the paradox of her nature in human form. To the people of Uruk, they were not aberrations but vessels of divine presence. Imagine the great festival of Inanna during the new year. The temple precinct swells with worshippers. Musicians strike drums, reed pipes trill, incense rises in fragrant clouds. At the center of the procession, a gala priest takes on the role of Inanna herself, stripping away ornaments one by one in a dramatic reenactment of the goddess's descent. Their voice shifts between registers, now high and plaintive, now low and guttural, echoing the goddess's journey through the 7 gates. To the crowd, this is not mere theatre. It is the goddess revealed through a body that transcends ordinary human categories. Modern scholars debate the exact nature of these roles. Some see them as early examples of institutionalized gender diversity. Others caution against projecting modern categories onto ancient practice. What is clear, however, is that the Sumerians themselves recognized and sanctified identities that were neither strictly male nor strictly female. They inscribed this recognition into their myths, their rituals, and their administrative records. Later, Mesopotamian societies treated such figures with more ambivalence. By the Assyrian period, texts sometimes portrayed them negatively, as effeminate or corrupt. Over centuries, the sacred status of Inanna's gender-fluid servants faded into marginalization. Yet the earliest Sumerian records remind us that at civilization's dawn, there was space for people whose identities defied easy labels, and that space was not marginal but central to the worship of one of the most powerful deities. The existence of the Gala, Kurgaru, and Asinu challenges science and history alike because it resists the narrative of progress from primitive rigidity to modern tolerance. Instead, it shows that complexity of identity was acknowledged at the very beginning of civilization, woven into its myths and preserved in its temples. Even today, the echoes of their songs survive. Laments written by Gala priests are among the earliest examples of music in recorded history. Their words, pressed into clay, preserve the sound of voices that blurred identity in service of the divine. Though we cannot hear the melodies, we can still read the lyrics, and in them we catch a glimpse of a society where gender itself was fluid, sacred, and powerful. And as Inanna's servants dissolved human boundaries to embody divine paradox, so too did Sumerian myths dissolve the boundary between real and imagined cities. Tales of rivals beyond the mountains, like the legendary golden city of Aratta, which stood both everywhere and nowhere at once. Among the fragments of Sumerian poetry preserved on clay lies a cycle of epics unlike any other. They speak of Aratta, a distant city described in glowing terms, rich in gold, silver, and lapis lazuli, filled with master craftsmen and artisans, a place of divine favour rivaling Uruk itself. Yet when archaeologists scour the Mesopotamian plain, they find no trace of Aratta. Was it real or imagined? The most detailed account appears in the poem Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta. Here Enmerkar, ruler of Uruk, seeks to build a temple for the goddess Inanna. To do so, he demands Aratta send tribute, precious metals, carved stones, and workers skilled in crafting. But the Lord of Aratta resists, claiming Inanna favours his city instead. What follows is not a battle of swords but of words. Messengers travel back and forth across mountains, carrying riddles, incantations, and boasts. Victory comes not through conquest but through persuasion, ritual, and the will of the gods. The poem situates Aratta far away, beyond the mountains, 7 ranges distant, a place accessible only through long and perilous travel. Some scholars suggest this points east, toward the Iranian plateau. Others propose the lands near the Caspian Sea, or even regions closer to the Indus Valley. Archaeological sites such as Jiroft and Shardad in southeastern Iran, where elaborate carved stone vessels and evidence of complex metallurgy have been found, are sometimes cited as possible reflections of Arata's memory. But no site matches perfectly. The city remains elusive, existing more fully in story than in soil. The epics surrounding Aratta are fascinating because they frame rivalry in cultural rather than military terms. Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta do not meet in battlefields, but in contests of endurance, wit, and ritual performance. One tale describes a spell of Nudimud, a magical incantation spoken in a single tongue so powerful it unites humanity. Another speaks of a contest in which the two cities compete to deliver tribute and maintain the favour of Inana. This emphasis suggests that Sumerians imagined civilization not as brute conquest, but as competition in creativity, piety, and divine recognition. Imagine a Sumerian scribe reciting the story by lamplight in Uruk's temple courtyard. His voice carries across the crowd. Descriptions of caravans laden with gold dust, lapis shining like captured starlight, artisans carving images so delicate they seem to breathe. To listeners, Aratta was both real and unreal, a city of abundance that confirmed Uruk's greatness by contrast. To defeat Aratta was not to erase it, but to prove Uruk's divine favour. Aratta's presence in myth also reveals something deeper about Sumerian thought, the need for a rival to measure oneself against. Uruk was the world's first true metropolis, but greatness without opposition is fragile. By inventing or remembering Aratta, the Sumerians created a mirror, a city that was everything Uruk was, but more so. If Uruk embodied political power and urban order, Aratta embodied raw abundance and artistry. The tension between them dramatized the struggle at the heart of civilization, control versus creativity, authority versus inspiration. Later versions of the Aratta cycle add curious details. In one tale, the journey to Aratta takes 10 days across mountain ranges, suggesting real geographical knowledge of distant lands. In another, Aratta is described as rich in resources but lacking in grain and food, forcing dependence on Uruk for sustenance. This exchange of goods, food for luxury materials, mirrors actual trade patterns of the Bronze Age. Mesopotamia exported barley and wool while importing metals and stones. Thus, even if Aratta never existed as a single city, it may have represented the composite memory of Eastern trading partners. What unsettles historians is how consistently Aratta appears in Sumerian tradition, yet how completely absent it is from the archaeological record. Other legendary cities, like Troy or Ur, eventually left ruins. Aratta leaves only words. Was it swallowed by shifting rivers? Was it a poetic metaphor for foreign lands beyond the Zagros? Or was it a symbolic city, existing only in the imagination, designed to dramatize Uruk's supremacy? The story of Aratta challenges science because it straddles that line between history and myth. On one hand, it encodes memories of real trade with distant highland cultures. On the other, it elevates those memories into allegory, creating a city of perfection no archaeologist can find. The tension mirrors the larger paradox of Sumer itself, a civilization both tangible and elusive, both recorded in clay and lost in silence. Picture the imagined Aratta as Sumerians might have seen it, a city gleaming with gold facades, artisans carving lapis into jewels, smoke rising from forges that turned ore into shining blades. Its streets throng with people dressed in woven silks. Its temples glow with polished stone unknown in the flatlands of Mesopotamia. Against this dream, Uruk measured itself, and by defeating Aratta in story, affirmed its destiny as the true chosen city of Inana. But when the epic cycles ended, Aratta vanished. Later Mesopotamian texts rarely mention it. By the time of Babylon, the name was already a mystery. Yet its absence speaks as loudly as its presence. Every civilization carries in its memory a golden rival, a place that is never quite real but always necessary. For the Sumerians, that rival was Aratta, and just as Aratta dissolves into myth, so too does Sumer's very language, a tongue with no known relatives, appearing suddenly, existing for centuries, then vanishing into silence, leaving scholars with questions no translation can answer. On a cracked clay tablet unearthed at Nippur, the wedge-shaped signs of cuneiform line up in ordered rows. Scholars can read the words, reconstruct their grammar, even translate their meaning. But beyond that, there is a silence no science has been able to bridge. The language is Sumerian, the world's first known written language, and it has no relatives. No parent tongue, no siblings, no descendants. It stands completely alone, as if it came into being fully formed and then vanished without leaving heirs. Most languages belong to families that can be traced like branches on a tree. English belongs to the Germanic branch of the Indo-European family, linking it to Sanskrit in India and Latin in Rome. Arabic and Hebrew belong to the Semitic family. Even isolates like Basque or Ainu are often suspected of having deep, faint ties to other tongues. But Sumerian defies all attempts at classification. Despite 2 centuries of comparative study, it has not been convincingly linked to any other language, living or dead. The paradox is deepened by what the earliest Sumerian texts reveal. By 3100 BC, when the first writing appears, the language is already complex and mature. Cuneiform inscriptions show a sophisticated grammar, verbs conjugated for tense and mood, nouns marked with multiple cases, intricate systems of prefixes and suffixes. This is not the hesitant experimentation of a society learning to record speech. It is the written form of a language that had already been spoken for centuries, perhaps millennia, before anyone pressed it into clay. Some examples highlight its strangeness. Unlike most languages of the region, Sumerian is agglutinative, meaning words are built from chains of affixes attached to a root. A single verb could carry layers of meaning: subject, object, tense, direction, and mood, all woven into one long form. For instance, a word like Muna-du-3 can mean "he built it for her," with each syllable encoding a different grammatical element. This feature is shared with languages like Turkish or Japanese, but no direct connection can be drawn. It is as though Sumerian grew on its own branch, parallel to others, touching none. Equally unusual is its vocabulary. Some Sumerian words have been borrowed into later languages, especially Akkadian, but many stand alone with no known cognates. The word for temple, Ai, simply means house. The word for god, Dingir, is written with a star symbol, linking divinity to the heavens. These terms echo across thousands of tablets, familiar in Sumerian context but alien elsewhere. When the language finally died out as a spoken tongue around 2000 BC, it left no descendants to preserve them. And yet, Sumerian refused to vanish completely. For over 1,000 years after it ceased to be spoken, scribes continued to study and copy it. Akkadian, a Semitic language, replaced Sumerian in daily life, but the old tongue survived in schools, prayers, and rituals. Babylonian scribes compiled bilingual dictionaries, painstakingly listing Sumerian words with their Akkadian equivalents. Thanks to these ancient glossaries, modern scholars were eventually able to reconstruct Sumerian. In a sense, it lived on as a language of scholarship and ritual, much as Latin endured long after Rome's fall. Still, its origins remain a mystery. Some suggest it came from migrants who settled the southern Mesopotamian marshes, bringing with them a tongue that had no local relatives. Others propose it was the remnant of an even older linguistic family, now entirely erased. A few point to submerged lands in the Persian Gulf basin, habitable during the Ice Age, drowned after 6000 BC, as a possible cradle of Sumerian speech. If people once lived there, their language may have been Sumerian or its ancestor, preserved only in clay tablets written centuries later. The enigma challenges linguistics itself. Language change usually leaves traces, cognates in distant tongues, fragments in loanwords, echoes in grammar. Sumerian has none. It is both the first written language and a voice without kin. Was it always isolated, born of unique conditions in Mesopotamia? Or was it the last survivor of a once wider family, its cousins all fallen silent? We cannot know. Imagine a scribe in Babylon around 700 BC. The streets outside bustle in Akkadian, the empire's common tongue. But in the temple school, the scribe bends over a tablet, copying lines in Sumerian. His stylus etches words no one has spoken for 1,000 years, preserving hymns to Inana, incantations to Enki, king lists stretching back before the flood. He may not fully understand them, but he trusts their sacred weight. To him, Sumerian is a language of the gods, a tongue that bridges earth and heaven. In this way, a language that died in the mouths of its people continued in the hands of scholars, echoing across millennia. The fact that we can read Sumerian today is almost miraculous. When explorers first unearthed cuneiform tablets in the 19th century, no one could decipher them. It took decades of effort, comparing inscriptions in multiple languages, before scholars cracked the code. Even now, Sumerian grammar resists complete mastery. Many tablets remain uncertain in translation, their meanings debated. We read Sumerian, but never with the confidence we read Greek or Latin. It remains, in some sense, an undeciphered language, half understood, always hinting at depths beyond our reach. The strangeness of Sumerian unsettles our sense of history. If the first written language is an isolate with no traceable relatives, what does that say about the prehistory we have lost? How many other languages lived and died without leaving marks in clay or stone? Sumerian may be the only survivor of an entire forgotten world of speech, a ghostly voice carried into writing while all others vanished. Science cannot explain why Sumerian stands alone. It may have been chance, it may have been survival, or it may point to cultural legacies older than the written record, preserved only in myth and ritual. What we know is that the language exists like a solitary monument, a tower of words standing apart, challenging us to imagine the conversations it once joined, the kinships it once had. And just as Sumerian language stretches impossibly back into silence, so too does its own history of kingship, a record where rulers are said to reign for tens of thousands of years, lifespans longer than civilization itself, carved into the enigmatic Sumerian King List. In a quiet room at Oxford's Ashmolean Museum stands a four-sided clay prism, about the size of a hand. Its surface is covered on all sides with neat rows of wedge-shaped cuneiform. This is the Weld Blundell prism, one of the most complete versions of the Sumerian King List, a text that unsettles historians because it weaves myth and history into a seamless whole. At first, the list reads like a chronicle of rulers, city after city, king after king. But then the numbers leap into impossibility. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalgar, for 36,000 years. Another, Dumuzid the Shepherd, for 36,000 years more. In total, before the flood, 10 kings ruled for nearly 500,000 years. Then abruptly, the pattern changes. After the flood, reigns shrink to centuries, then decades, aligning more closely with archaeological timelines. The King List thus divides history into two worlds, the antediluvian, before the flood, and the post-diluvian, after the flood. In the first, rulers are semi-divine, their reigns stretching into cosmic time. In the second, kings are mortal, subject to the limits of human life. This stark contrast mirrors Sumerian mythology itself, in which the flood represents a cosmic reset, a boundary between an age of gods and an age of men. What makes the King List especially puzzling is that some rulers mentioned after the flood are historically real. Kings such as Gilgamesh of Uruk and Ur-Nammu of Ur are attested by inscriptions and ruins. Their reigns, though exaggerated, fit roughly within the scope of human lifespans. This means the King List is not pure myth. It is a hybrid, blending genuine history with timescales that defy comprehension. Scholars have offered various explanations. Some argue that the enormous rains are symbolic, reflecting cycles of the moon or ceremonial saros periods rather than literal years. Others suggest they encode cosmic numerology. The figure 60, sacred in Sumer's sexagesimal system, recurs often in the lengths of rains. Multiples of 60, 600, or 3600 appear in ways that suggest deliberate mathematical structuring rather than historical memory. Still others believe the numbers encode astronomical knowledge, cycles of stars and planets recorded as lifespans of kings. Yet the precision of the numbers resists easy dismissal. Why write 28,800 years instead of a vague countless? Why tally reigns with such specificity if they were purely symbolic? The list feels bureaucratic, as if scribes were recording actual data handed down from a source we no longer understand. Archaeology adds another layer. Excavations at sites like Shuruppak and Uruk reveal thick layers of flood-deposited silt dating to around 2900 BC, interrupting normal occupation. These layers are not global in scale, but they show that massive floods did strike Mesopotamia. The King List's division of time into before the flood and after the flood may therefore preserve a real geological memory, an event so destructive it marked the boundary between eras. Imagine a Sumerian priest reciting the King List in a temple court. His voice rolls across the crowd. Alulim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years. Alalgar ruled for 36,000. Then the flood swept over. Afterward, kingship descended again from heaven. For his audience, these were not absurdities but truths. The vast numbers conveyed majesty, anchoring kingship in the timeless authority of the gods. Each new ruler could trace legitimacy not only to human ancestors but to a divine lineage stretching back before memory itself. To the Sumerians, time was not linear, it was cyclical, folded, elastic. The King List does not separate myth from fact because the two were never separate in their worldview. Cosmic ages flowed into human reigns. A king could be both man and myth, both historical figure and cosmic archetype. The text is less a history than a theology of power. Still, the unanswered questions haunt us. Did the Sumerians preserve distant memories of real rulers, their lifespans distorted through generations of retelling? Could they have remembered elders who lived longer than us, recorded as impossibly vast spans? Or were these reigns meant to encode something else? Astronomical cycles, ritual calendars, or symbolic ages? Modern scholarship cannot decide. What we do know is that the King List had enduring influence. Later Mesopotamian dynasties copied and updated it, inserting their own rulers into its cosmic timeline. By doing so, they tied their authority to the same divine descent as Alulim and Gilgamesh. The text was both archive and propaganda, a way to anchor fragile human power in eternal order. Even outside Mesopotamia, echoes remain. The biblical genealogies of Genesis, with patriarchs living for hundreds of years before the flood, parallel the Sumerian structure. Greek myths of golden ages and floods, Indian accounts of long-lived kings and cosmic cycles, all resonate with the same logic, that time once stretched differently, that catastrophe reset the world, that history is measured in ages, not just years. Standing before the Weld-Blundell prism today, one feels that tension. On one side are names we can confirm through archaeology. On the other are lifespans that stretch beyond imagination. The clay does not distinguish between them. It presents all as one story, one continuous descent of kingship from heaven to earth. The King List challenges science not by offering impossibilities alone, but by refusing to separate myth from memory. It asks us to consider that the first historians did not write to record facts, but to shape meaning. For the Sumerians, time itself was political, sacred, and mysterious. Their kings did not simply rule years, they ruled ages. And as we leave the impossible spans of reigns, Another puzzle emerges from their carvings. Divine beings carrying curious objects, small bags clutched in their hands, repeated across centuries of Mesopotamian art, the enigmatic handbags of the gods. On the walls of Assyrian palaces and the seals of Sumerian temples, one motif repeats with an almost unsettling persistence. Winged figures stand in profile, their feathers carved in careful detail, one hand extended toward a sacred tree or king. In their other hand, they carry an object instantly recognizable to modern eyes. A small rectangular container with a rounded handle. We call it, for lack of a better name, the handbag of the gods. The motif appears as early as the Sumerians, around the 3rd millennium BC, and persists through Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian art for over 1,000 years. Always the bag looks the same, square or slightly rounded, often decorated with horizontal lines suggesting texture. Sometimes the figure carrying it holds a pine cone-like object in the opposite hand, as if sprinkling liquid from the bag. Sometimes the bag is held beside the tree of life, sometimes presented before kings, sometimes carried during processions. But nowhere do the inscriptions explain what it was. Conventional scholarship has proposed practical explanations. The bag, some argue, is simply a bucket used in purification rituals, filled with water or pollen. The pinecone would then serve as a sprinkler, scattering droplets to bless a person or space. This interpretation is supported by later Mesopotamian texts that describe rituals of cleansing before ceremonies. And yet, the sheer consistency of the symbol, repeated over centuries without variation, suggests something more than a mundane container. Why depict gods, beings of cosmic power, holding a common bucket? The mystery deepens when we consider how the motif crosses cultures. Versions of the handbag shape have been noted not only in Mesopotamian art, but also in Mesoamerican carvings of the Olmec and later Maya. There too, figures carry small pouches with curved handles, often linked to fertility or divine authority. Mainstream archaeology attributes this to coincidence, but for those drawn to deeper speculation, the parallel suggests shared symbolic memory, a sign carried across oceans and ages. For the Sumerians themselves, context is telling. The handbag most often appears in association with the tree of life or with kingship rituals. It seems to have functioned as a symbol of divine power, a vessel that carried not water alone, but the essence of legitimacy. Some scholars have suggested it may represent the container of the me, the decrees of civilization that Inana once seized from Enki, including laws, music, crafts, and wisdom. If so, the bag is not a tool, but a metaphor, the gods holding the very principles of order, distributing them to humankind. Imagine a procession in Uruk, carved in miniature on a cylinder seal. Winged deities stride forward, bags swinging at their sides. Before them stands a stylized tree, its branches curling into symmetrical spirals. The figures dip their pinecone-shaped objects into the bags and raise them toward the tree, as though feeding it with unseen power. To the Sumerians, watching such imagery was not passive. It was revelation. The carvings were not decorations, but instructions in myth made visible. The fascination lies in what the carvings never show, the bag open. Its contents remain forever hidden. No inscription names what it held. No tablet describes its making. It is always closed, always carried, always mysterious. It is as if the power of the motif lay precisely in its secrecy, in the fact that it represented something never to be revealed. Some fringe interpretations push further, seeing the handbag as evidence of lost technology, containers of seeds from a forgotten civilization, portable power devices, even symbolic field kits of visiting beings. While mainstream archaeology does not support such claims, the persistence of the motif does invite us to ask why it mattered so much, why it endured unchanged when other artistic conventions shifted over centuries. Consider the broader Mesopotamian worldview. To them, the gods were not distant abstractions, but beings who managed the cosmos through objects and decrees. Enki held the waters of wisdom. Nana steered the moon across the sky. Inana carried the me, tablets of divine order. Within this symbolic logic, a bag carried by a god could easily represent a portable vessel of sacred power, an object that contained more than its small size suggested. Archaeologists have even uncovered miniature stone replicas of the bag, too small for practical use, buried in foundation deposits beneath temples. These may have served as tokens, invoking the divine presence of the object even when the actual ritual tool was absent. The fact that such replicas were carefully placed in sacred contexts underscores that the handbag was more than a casual accessory. It was a symbol woven into the very foundations of Sumerian sacred architecture. The persistence of the handbag motif across Mesopotamian history challenges science because it suggests the existence of a symbolic code now beyond our reach. We can read their words, translate their myths, analyze their tools, but their images remain half opaque. The gods' handbags are like sentences cut off midway, fragments of meaning that refuse to be fully deciphered. To stand before an Assyrian relief today, in the halls of the British Museum or the Louvre, is to feel the strangeness of the motif. The winged figure towers above, beard carefully curled, feathers etched in detail. His right hand lifts the pine cone, his left clutches the handbag. He seems caught in motion, mid-step, forever sprinkling power onto the sacred tree. What he carries is at once familiar and unknowable. It looks like something anyone could grasp, yet its meaning lies beyond us. For the Sumerians, the handbag may have been an everyday image of a bucket, or it may have been a symbol of the gods' ability to carry order, fertility, and wisdom wherever they went. For us, it is a puzzle, a reminder that symbols can outlast their explanations, that meaning can endure even when knowledge does not. And if the gods carried such enigmatic vessels, what of the other symbols carved on seals and tablets? Eyes, trees, creatures part human and part beast. These images form another forgotten language, a code of pictures that spoke to the Sumerians but now speaks only in riddles. In the hand, a Sumerian cylinder seal feels small, no larger than a finger, yet when rolled across damp clay, it unfurls entire worlds. A single turn of the cylinder produces a continuous frieze, gods flanking sacred trees, kings in ritual postures, animals morphing into hybrids, geometric patterns radiating outward. These are not random decorations, they are messages, but to us, much of their meaning is lost. Cylinder seals first appear in Uruk around 3300 BC, contemporary with the earliest tablets of writing. At first they were simple, marking ownership of goods or sealing containers, but soon they evolved into miniature artworks, intricate as jewellery, carved with drills, burins, and abrasives. By the early dynastic period, every merchant, official, or scribe of status carried one. To press a seal into clay was to sign, authenticate, and protect. The seal was an identity, a personal cosmos rolled into every contract and jar. Yet the images carved into these seals raise questions. They show motifs that recur across centuries, gods holding vessels, winged beings attending to sacred trees, animals standing upright, composite creatures, part lion, part eagle, part man. To the Sumerians, these were part of a shared symbolic grammar. To us, they are riddles without a key. Some scenes clearly represent myths. Seals depict Inanna's marriage to Dumuzi, gods feasting, or kings receiving scepters from deities. Others are less clear. A horned figure stands beside a stylized pillar topped with an eye. Another shows two beings holding what look like buckets and pine cones before a sacred tree. Still others depict fish-bodied men emerging from water, later echoed in Babylonian stories of Oan, the amphibious sage who brought knowledge to humanity. What exactly these symbols conveyed to their original audience, we cannot fully reconstruct. Consider the seal of the so-called banquet scene now in the Louvre. Figures recline at a table, drinking through long straws from a shared vessel. Behind them stand attendants with fans and instruments. It looks like a courtly party, but to a Sumerian, the arrangement of figures, the position of vessels, the presence of musical instruments, all carried layers of religious and social meaning. What appears to us as daily life may in fact encode ritual truths. Seals also carried legal and economic power. A jar of oil sealed with a merchant's cylinder carried his guarantee. A contract tablet sealed on all sides was legally binding. Yet even here, images mattered. A seal showing a worshipper before a god invoked divine witness. To break such a seal was not only fraud, but sacrilege. Symbol and law intertwined. Archaeologists have found thousands of these seals in materials ranging from soft steatite to hard hematite. Many were drilled so precisely that modern scholars marvel at the craftsmanship. Some contain lines so fine they require magnification to see, raising questions about the tools available to ancient engravers. Each seal was unique, a portable identity, a miniature masterpiece. But what challenges us most are the symbols whose meanings do not survive in text. Unlike cuneiform, which has bilingual dictionaries to aid decipherment, seal imagery has no Rosetta Stone. Its grammar was visual, its vocabulary shared but never explained. For the Sumerians, the meaning was obvious as a stop sign is to us today. For us, it is a silent language. Imagine a Sumerian merchant in Ur, pressing his seal into clay before shipping a jar of beer. To his peers, the impression shows not just his name but his affiliations, his patron gods, perhaps even his professional guild. A single roll communicated layers of identity and authority. But when archaeologists dig it up 4,000 years later, all they see are figures and lines. The grammar of symbols is gone. Some seals seem almost cosmological. Stars and crescents float above sacred trees. Composite creatures guard entrances. Two figures pour water from vessels, streams flowing into a single river. An image scholars link to Enki, god of wisdom and freshwater. Was this theology in miniature, a portable myth pressed into every contract? Or was it a kind of talisman, ensuring divine favour over every transaction? There are even signs of cross-cultural exchange. Indus Valley seals have been found at Mesopotamian sites, their strange pictographs appearing alongside Sumerian symbols. Conversely, Mesopotamian motifs appear in Iranian and Anatolian contexts. The seal may have functioned as the world's first international passport, an object that crossed linguistic barriers through images. The silence of these symbols is frustrating because they clearly mattered. They were used for over 2,000 years. They appear on trade goods, legal documents, and ritual objects. Their consistency shows they carried real meaning. And yet, without explanation, we can only guess. Science offers hypotheses. Perhaps the imagery reinforced contracts by invoking divine witnesses. Perhaps they encoded status like coats of arms. Perhaps they were simply artistic flourishes. But none of these answers feels complete. The sheer repetition of motifs, gods with bags, trees with symmetrical branches, hybrid beings, suggests a code deeper than decoration. Standing in a museum today, gazing at a seal no larger than a bead, you can almost feel the weight of what is missing. The images are vivid, carved with skill, rolled out as if the figures were still walking across clay. They speak in a voice we cannot hear. They are fragments of a conversation we have lost, a language that died without translation. The forgotten symbols of Sumer remind us that writing was not the only script. Parallel to cuneiform existed another system, one of pictures, myths, and visual codes. It was immediate, universal, and powerful, but also fragile. When the culture that understood it vanished, the code dissolved, leaving only images. And if these seals carried a language we can no longer read, what then of the myths that describe weapons alive with voices, storms stored in vaults, fire from the skies unleashed at divine command? Are those two symbols we misunderstand, or fragments of memory, distorted but real? On clay tablets from Mesopotamia, written in careful lines of cuneiform, are stories that blur the line between myth and memory. They describe gods not only as wielders of thunder or storm, but as owners of weapons with names, powers, and even voices. Among the most striking is the tale of Ninurta, the warrior son of Enlil, and his weapon known as Sharur. Sharur is no ordinary mace. In the Lugale poem it speaks. It scouts ahead of battle, warns Ninurta of danger, and advises strategy. It is described as flying across the battlefield, striking enemies at great distances. In one passage, it crushes mountains at Ninurta's command. To modern ears, this sounds uncanny. A weapon that combines intelligence, mobility, and destructive force. Was this pure mythological embellishment, or the echo of something else? A memory of tools too advanced for their time? Inana, goddess of love and war, is also associated with formidable arsenals. Texts describe her me of battle, decrees or powers that included storms, fire, and weapons stored in hidden chambers. In hymns, she boasts of riding into battle with gales at her side and lightning in her hands. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, she offers the hero a chariot of lapis lazuli and gold, pulled by supernatural creatures. These are not described vaguely. The materials, the form, even the sound of these divine devices are catalogued in detail, as though drawn from direct observation. The flood story, too, frames destruction as weaponry. In the Epic of Atrahasis, the gods unleash disaster not as an accident of nature, but as a decision of war against humanity. The storm is commanded like an army. Enlil gives the order, and the flood arrives as if deployed. Later, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the survivor Utnapishtim describes the storm as like a battle, with thunder and lightning deployed as organized forces. Archaeology supports the depth of these myths by showing how deeply Sumerians associated weapons with divine order. Excavations at temples reveal votive daggers of gold and bronze, too delicate for practical use, buried as ritual offerings. Wall plaques show gods and kings holding bows and staffs that glow with stylized rays. These were not symbols of mere violence. They were images of cosmic authority. Weapons were not just tools. They were embodiments of divine will. Imagine a Sumerian priest reciting these tales under torchlight. The crowd listens as Sharur speaks to Ninurta, as Inana unleashes storms from her arsenal. To them, this was not metaphor. It was memory of divine power shaping the fate of cities and kings. The weapons of the gods were as real to them as floods and harvests. Modern scholars wrestle with these accounts. Some read them as poetic metaphors. Storms personified, thunder described as divine weaponry. Others note the specificity. Weapons stored in vaults, prepared for use, given names and inventories. The idea that gods debated whether to unleash their tools, fearing consequences, sounds less like metaphor and more like the language of technology remembered in myth. Inanna's arsenal is especially revealing. Before her descent to the underworld, she must surrender her weapons one by one. Crown, scepter, breastplate, jewelry, described not as ornament, but as items of power. Each is catalogued as if it were a device, stripped away until she stands defenseless. The ritual detail suggests these objects were thought of as functional, not merely symbolic. There is also the recurring theme of weapons as hidden or forbidden knowledge. After the flood, texts say, the most destructive weapons were sealed away. They disappear from later myths. Ninurta no longer wields Sharur. Inanna's storm weapons are no longer listed. It is as though the storytellers preserved memory of their existence but erased their instructions, ensuring they could not be replicated. This pattern, memory without method, appears again and again in Mesopotamian tradition. Science cannot prove these were real technologies. No fragments of machines or advanced weapons have been excavated in Sumerian ruins. All evidence comes from texts and images. Yet the persistence of these accounts across centuries raises questions. Why describe weapons that think, speak, and strike at distance if no one had ever imagined such things before? Why preserve inventories of devices too precise to be poetic flourishes? Some researchers suggest these myths may encode memories of natural disasters, meteors falling from the sky, volcanic eruptions, lightning storms. To ancient eyes, these forces would indeed appear as weapons of gods. Others speculate more boldly that echoes of forgotten knowledge carried by survivors of earlier ages were retold in mythic form. The truth may never be known. What is undeniable is how central these sky weapons were to Sumerian imagination. They appear in myths of creation, in stories of flood, in hymns to gods of war. They shape the roles of deities, defining Inanna as both lover and destroyer, Ninurta as protector and avenger, Enlil as commander of storms. The weapons are not background detail, they are central to divine identity. Picture again the battlefield of myth. Ninurta stands atop a mountain, Sharur humming at his side, its voice whispering counsel. Below, armies clash. Above, lightning splits the sky. With a gesture, the weapon flies, crushing stone and scattering foes. In the distance, Inanna descends, storm clouds swirling at her command. This is how the Sumerians imagined divine war, not as human violence writ large, but as cosmic power made manifest. And just as the weapons of the gods blur the line between myth and technology, so too does their vision of the heavens. A sky not only filled with stars, but charted with precision, mapped as if it were itself a divine script. Each night over the plains of Mesopotamia, the sky stretched unbroken, a canopy of stars unmasked by mountains or forests. For the Sumerians, this dome was not decoration. It was a living calendar, a script written in light, telling them when to plant, when to harvest, when to celebrate, and when to mourn. Long before telescopes or observatories, they became meticulous students of the heavens, leaving behind records so precise that modern astronomy still marvels at their accuracy. The earliest tablets from Uruk and Ur show that Sumerians already divided the sky into recognizable constellations. The plough, corresponding to Taurus, marked the beginning of the agricultural season. The true shepherd of heaven, our Orion, was associated with great kingship. The Pleiades were known as a cluster of shining jewels. To them, stars were not cold fire. They were gods, messengers, and regulators of time. One of the most extraordinary documents is the Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, preserved later by Babylonian scribes, but rooted in Sumerian traditions. It records the appearance and disappearance of Venus over a cycle of years, noting when the bright planet rose before dawn or faded after sunset. This 8-year cycle is subtle, requiring decades of continuous observation to confirm. Yet the Sumerians had already mastered it by the 2nd millennium BC, and likely earlier. Such precision shows an astronomical discipline woven into daily ritual. They also track the phases of the moon with striking accuracy. The lunar month was set at 29, 5 days, and their calendar reconciled this with the solar year through intercalation, the deliberate insertion of extra months to keep seasons aligned. This method, used in Babylon and later adopted in Greece, appears first in Sumer. Without it, festivals and harvests would drift hopelessly out of sync. That they solved this problem so early testifies to their careful skywatching. Archaeology supports the picture of structured observation. Temples and ziggurats were often aligned with celestial events. Excavations at Ur and Nippur reveal foundations oriented towards solstice sunrises and significant star risings. The ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to Nana the moon god, functioned not only as temple but also as elevated platform from which priests could watch the heavens unobstructed. Rituals were timed not by convenience but by stellar order. Sumerian myths reinforce the connection. Inanna, goddess of love and war, was identified with Venus, her cycles of disappearance and return mirroring her mythical descent and resurrection. Utu, the sun god, crossed the heavens daily, while Nana, the moon, steered the months. The gods did not simply dwell in the sky, they were the sky. To track celestial patterns was to read divine will. Their interest in the heavens extended to omen literature. Tablets from later Mesopotamian periods preserved detailed records of eclipses, comets, and unusual planetary alignments. These were not noted casually, they were interpreted as signs of divine judgment. A lunar eclipse might mean danger for the king. A bright conjunction of Mars and Jupiter might signal war or prosperity. Though framed as divination, these texts also preserve valuable astronomical data, exact dates, sky conditions, and observations spanning centuries. Imagine a Sumerian priest astronomer on the rooftop of a temple at Ur, stylus in hand, marking the faint glimmer of Venus before dawn. He notes the date, the phase of the moon, the hour of appearance. His father did the same before him, and his son will do the same after. Over generations, these observations accumulate, revealing patterns invisible to a single lifetime. In this patient work lies the origin of astronomy: continuity, discipline, faith in the order of the cosmos. What puzzles modern science is how quickly this knowledge appears. Just as writing and metallurgy emerged fully developed, so too does astronomy. The earliest surviving lists of stars and planets are already systematic, already tied to calendars and rituals. We see no long trail of tentative sketches, no crude charts evolving into precision. Instead, we find a system in place, as though the Sumerians inherited sky maps along with their cities and laws. There are tantalizing anomalies. Some tablets describe stars we cannot identify, or celestial phenomena that no longer exist. One text mentions a star that rises red, turns white, and disappears without return. Was this a supernova, observed once and forgotten? Another records a cluster that may not correspond to any visible group today. These mysteries remind us how much the night sky itself changes across millennia, and how much knowledge can vanish when interpretation is lost. For the Sumerians, astronomy was never science in the modern sense. It was sacred order, the rhythm by which gods measured human fate. Yet in pursuing divine will, they achieved scientific precision. Their sexagesimal system, based on 60, proved ideal for dividing circles, hours, and angles, shaping not only astronomy, but mathematics itself. When we say an hour has 60 minutes or a circle 360 degrees, we are speaking the language of Sumerian skywatchers. The challenge for science today is to place Sumerian astronomy in context. How could the first civilization already track planets, predict eclipses, and construct calendars with such skill? Did necessity, irrigation, farming, ritual, drive rapid advances? Or did they preserve fragments of older sky knowledge, carried from forgotten communities displaced by floods and migrations? What remains clear is the intimacy between Sumerians and the sky. For them, the stars were not remote. They were woven into life, law, and myth. Their temples rose as stairways to heaven. Their myths mirrored planetary cycles. Their calendars tied human time to cosmic time. To read their tablets is to glimpse a worldview where earth and sky were never separate. And among these voices of the heavens, one stands out, a human voice. Not a god, not a myth, but a woman, Enheduanna, the first named author in history, who composed hymns to the moon and stars that still echo across 4,000 years. Among the tens of thousands of Sumerian and Akkadian tablets, most are anonymous. Records of grain shipments, temple inventories, tax accounts, hymns copied by scribes whose names were lost in time. But in a handful of tablets, a voice steps out of the shadows and introduces herself. She writes, "I, Enheduanna, the high priestess of Nana." With those words, history changes. For the first time, we hear not only a collective tradition, but an individual claiming authorship. Enheduanna is the world's earliest known named author, a woman who lived around 2300 BC. Enheduanna was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, the conqueror who forged the first great Mesopotamian empire. To secure control over the Sumerian south, Sargon appointed her as High Priestess of Nana, the moon god, at Ur. Her position was political, uniting Akkadian and Sumerian traditions, but Enheduanna transformed it into something more. She wrote, she prayed, she lamented, and she signed her name. Her most famous works are the temple hymns and the exaltation of Inana. The hymns are a series of compositions dedicated to temples across Sumer. They describe sanctuaries with vivid imagery, walls glistening with lapis lazuli, gates guarded by lions, roofs glittering like the night sky. They are not mere lists, they are literary creations, weaving devotion with architecture, theology with poetry. In them, Enheduanna situates herself as the voice of empire, linking disparate cities into a single sacred network. The exaltation of Inanna, however, is personal. It tells of her expulsion from the temple during political upheaval. She describes walking among thorn bushes, stripped of her crown, abandoned in despair. She pleads with Inanna, goddess of love and war, for restoration. Her voice quivers with pain. They made me dwell in the house of dust. My sweet mouth became scum. Yet she also exults in triumph when restored. What I have done, no one has done before me. The poem moves between lament, prayer, and self-assertion, blending personal suffering with cosmic imagery. For modern readers, the shock lies in how intimate and human her words feel. Unlike anonymous hymns, Enheduanna's compositions are filled with first-person emotion, grief, anger, pride, resilience. She does not hide behind collective ritual. She writes as herself. 4,000 years later, her voice still resonates. Archaeology supports her historical presence. In the ruins of Ur, a carved stone disc was found bearing her image. She is depicted wearing a priestess's robe, standing in procession with other figures. The inscription names her as Enheduanna, wife of Nana, daughter of Sargon. This is no literary fiction. She lived, held office, and left behind both artifacts and texts. Her role as high priestess gave her unique power. The priestess of Nana, known as the Entu, performed rituals that joined the city to its god, ensuring fertility and stability. By placing his daughter in this position, Sargon wove together political authority with divine legitimacy. Enheduanna became the hinge between empire and temple, but she was not merely a figurehead. Through her writings, she actively shaped religious identity, establishing Inanna as a supreme goddess in the Mesopotamian pantheon. Imagine Enheduanna at night in the Ziggurat of Ur. The moon god's shrine glows in torchlight. The desert wind carries distant sounds of cattle and reed boats on canals. Seated at a low table, stylus in hand, she presses signs into wet clay. Her words are not contracts or inventories, but hymns of devotion, lines of poetry, laments of exile. She pauses, breathes, and writes her own name. She knows that clay endures. In doing so, she ensures that her voice will outlast her life, perhaps outlast even her civilization. Her works were copied in scribal schools for centuries after her death. Students memorized her hymns, practiced her style, recited her prayers. Through them, her voice survived long after her empire collapsed. When archaeologists first deciphered Sumerian and Akkadian, they recognized her authorship not through a modern attribution, but because she herself declared it on the tablets. She is not an invention of modern scholarship. She is the author of herself. For science and history, Enheduanna challenges assumptions. We often imagine the first civilizations as collective, anonymous, faceless. Yet here, at the dawn of writing, stands a named author, a woman producing literature that blends politics, theology, and autobiography. Her presence undermines the idea that individuality in literature came only much later with the Greeks or Hebrews. Instead, it was present at the very beginning, in the voice of a priestess who lived more than 4,000 years ago. Her story also complicates gender assumptions. In a patriarchal society, Enheduanna's authority and voice stand out. She was both political instrument and independent poet, priestess and exile, daughter of empire, and woman of personal suffering. She shows us that early Mesopotamian women could wield power and leave legacies as enduring as kings. Even today, her words retain their power. To read the exaltation of Inana is to feel the anguish of betrayal, the defiance of survival, the triumph of restoration. Her poetry is not distant ritual, but raw experience, carved into clay. She reaches across time with startling immediacy, and in her survival lies the paradox of Sumer itself. The cities crumbled, the languages died, the Ziggurats eroded. But her voice endures, fragile yet unbroken, carried by clay through floods, wars, and centuries of silence. We hear her still. Enheduanna, the first author, speaking from the world's first civilization. On a tablet of sun-baked clay, cracked and worn with age, is a decree from King Ur-Nammu of Ur, dating to around 2100 BC. It begins with an invocation. The gods An and Enlil granted kingship to Ur-Nammu, and with that authority he established equity in the land. Then follow the laws, short, practical, written in simple Sumerian. If a man commits murder, that man shall be killed. If a man commits robbery, he shall be put to death. If a man divorces his first-time wife, he shall pay her 1 mina of silver. The Code of Ur-Nammu is the oldest surviving law code in the world. What makes it remarkable is not only its age, but its balance between punishment and restitution. Unlike the later and more famous Code of Hammurabi, which leaned heavily on an eye for an eye, Ur-Nammu's code often replaced vengeance with compensation. If a man knocked out another's tooth, he paid silver. If someone injured another, fines were levied according to social rank. To modern readers, the punishments may feel harsh, but they also show an early attempt to regulate justice with consistency rather than revenge. Archaeologists have discovered fragments of this code at Nippur and Ur, confirming that it was copied in scribal schools, remembered centuries after Ur-Nammu's reign. Its survival suggests it became a model, not just a royal decree, but a framework for thinking about fairness in society. The concept of law itself was revolutionary. Before Sumer, disputes were resolved by custom, elders, or local leaders. With written codes, justice became public and enduring. It was no longer dependent on memory or personal authority. It was inscribed in clay, accessible for generations. The law outlived the king. This was an astonishing leap. The idea that principles of justice could be fixed, consulted, and appealed to beyond any individual. But Sumerian justice was not equal. Society was divided into classes: the Lugal, nobles, the Lu, commoners, and slaves. The code prescribed different penalties depending on status. For example, harming a noble carried heavier fines than harming a commoner. Women, too, were often treated as dependents of fathers or husbands, their rights limited though not erased. A wife accused of infidelity could face drowning, while a husband who cast aside his wife owed her silver but kept his freedom. Yet even within this hierarchy, the existence of law provided structure. Contracts were written for marriages, loans, and sales, sealed with cylinder seals. Disputes could be brought before judges who referenced written principles. In a society of growing cities, with strangers trading and living together, such predictability was essential. The code created trust in transactions and stability in governance. Imagine a case in Ur around 2000 BC. Two farmers quarrel over a boundary stone marking their fields. The dispute escalates until they bring the matter to the city's judges. In the temple precinct, a scribe unrolls a tablet from the archives. The law states that boundary markers must be respected, and if moved, the offender must pay a fine. The judgment is pronounced, the seal pressed, and both men know the decision carries authority beyond personal opinion. Justice has been enacted not by whim, but by written principle. The Sumerians tied their codes to divine order. Shamash, the sun god, was regarded as the god of justice, his light symbolizing truth. Kings portrayed themselves not as inventors of law, but as its guardians, entrusted by the gods to maintain balance. This divine connection gave legitimacy, but also imposed limits. Even kings were bound, in theory, to the principles laid down in writing. Over time, other Sumerian rulers issued their own codes. Lipit Ishtar of Isin, around 1930 BC, proclaimed laws regulating inheritance, adoption, and contracts. Each code echoed earlier traditions while adapting to new circumstances. By the time Hammurabi inscribed his famous stele in Babylon centuries later, the idea of codified justice was already a long-standing Mesopotamian legacy. The physical tablets themselves reveal something profound about how Sumerians saw justice. Many were placed in temple archives, not palaces. Law was not the private property of kings, but the shared foundation of community, overseen by gods and priests. To disobey the law was not just a crime against society, but an offense against divine order. Yet the paradox remains. For all their fairness, the codes also entrenched inequality. They protected property more zealously than people, favoured the wealthy over the poor, and often reduced women to commodities. Justice for Sumer was never universal. It was hierarchical, stratified, and deeply tied to social status. The same code that offered compensation for injury also ordered drowning for an adulterous wife. Progress and oppression coexisted, pressed into the same clay. And yet, to see justice written at all was a revolution. It meant that power could be constrained, that disputes could be resolved without endless cycles of vengeance. It was the birth of a principle we still hold today, that law should be visible, consistent, and binding. The clay tablets of Ur and Nippur are the ancestors of every law book, every constitution, every courtroom archive. Standing before one of these tablets in a museum today, you see neat wedges pressed into clay 4,000 years ago. They are not abstract symbols. They are the voices of lawmakers and scribes who believed that fairness could be made permanent, that rules could outlast rulers. The tablet is cracked, but the principle remains. The codes of justice show us a civilization striving to create order out of chaos, even if that order was imperfect. They remind us that justice is never absolute but always negotiated between ideals and realities. And they hint at something Sumerians themselves may have sensed, that law is both a gift and a danger, able to protect but also to oppress. As the Sumerians wrote justice into clay, so too did they write remedies for the body, tablets of herbs, rituals, and healing prayers that reveal another paradox, a medicine at once practical and mystical, a science of herbs bound to the whispers of gods. In a quiet chamber at Nippur, archaeologists uncovered a clay tablet covered with wedge-shaped marks. At first it seemed like another account of trade or taxes, but the words described something else, a prescription. If the head hurts, boil willow with honey. Drink when the moon sets. If the pain remains, inscribe the name of Enki on clay and place it beneath the pillow. This blending of herbal remedy with ritual invocation captures the paradox of Sumerian medicine. It was at once practical and mystical, rooted in observation yet steeped in the language of gods. Science expects medicine to grow slowly from superstition to rational practice. But here, at the dawn of history, we find a system already sophisticated, one that categorized illnesses, recorded symptoms, prescribed treatments, and even tracked outcomes. The Sumerian healer, called the Ashipu or Asu, worked at the boundary of priest and physician. Tablets record their detailed knowledge of anatomy, the liver as the center of blood, the heart as a vessel of spirit, the brain connected to thought. They set broken bones with splints, performed surgeries with copper instruments, and recognized symptoms with remarkable precision. Some tablets describe different kinds of headaches, tension, fever, one-sided pain, distinctions that modern neurologists still use. And their remedies were not without effect. Willow bark, prescribed for pain, contains salicin, the precursor to aspirin. Garlic was used for infections, honey as an antiseptic, poppy extracts for severe pain. Modern pharmacology confirms the effectiveness of many of these treatments. The science hidden in their prescriptions is undeniable. But alongside herbs and salves, There were incantations, rituals, and offerings. Illness was not only physical but spiritual, a sign of divine displeasure or demonic intrusion. Healing required both the restoration of the body and the appeasement of the unseen. A patient with stomach pain might receive willow bark tea, but also a ritual prayer to Gula, goddess of healing. To modernize, this looks contradictory, but perhaps the Sumerians grasped something subtle, that healing touches mind, spirit, and community as much as body. Imagine a patient in Ur around 2000 BC. He lies in a reed mat bed, fever burning, family gathered anxiously. The healer arrives, carrying both a basket of herbs and a tablet of incantations. A potion is mixed, cool water poured over the patient's brow. At the same time, sacred words are whispered, the rhythm steady, the voice hypnotic. To the family, the ritual affirms that their suffering is seen by gods. To the patient, the chant soothes, the medicine eases pain. The community's presence heals isolation. Archaeology reveals temple complexes with chambers that appear to have served as clinics, spaces with drains, water basins, and storage rooms for herbs. Some even suggest primitive surgical theatres. Tablets describe trepanation, the drilling of holes into skulls to relieve pressure, a technique found in cultures worldwide. The Sumerians were part of this early global experimentation with the boundaries of healing. Science is challenged here because it prefers a straight line, superstition giving way to rationality. But Sumerian medicine was never merely superstition. It was empirical, systematic, and holistic. Its failures were real, but so were its successes. Perhaps what we dismiss as ritual carried psychological power. Modern science is only beginning to rediscover the placebo effect, the healing of belief, the medicine of meaning. Yet, just as with law and astronomy, the Sumerians did not explain where this knowledge came from. Their texts speak of gods bestowing healing arts whole, not developed step by step. Did they inherit fragments of an older system, preserved through floods and migrations? Or did necessity itself drive them to integrate spirit and science in ways we no longer attempt? And just as their healers sought to cure the sick, their myths sought to cure memory itself, telling of a flood that swept away the old world and forced humanity to begin again. In the Epic of Atrahasis, preserved on clay tablets over 3,000 years old, the gods meet in council. They are restless, weary of humanity's clamour. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I cannot sleep. The decision is made. A flood will sweep clean the earth, erasing humanity in a single vast deluge. Only one man, warned in a dream, builds a great boat to preserve life. His name is Atrahasis, or in other versions, Ziusudra, ancestor to Noah. This Sumerian flood story predates the Bibles by more than a millennium. Its details are hauntingly familiar. The ark built to precise measurements, the gathering of animals, the sending of birds to test for dry land. But its origins remain mysterious. Was it myth, allegory, or memory of a real catastrophe? Archaeology adds an unsettling clue. At sites such as Shuruppak and Uruk, excavators have uncovered thick layers of silt interrupting normal settlement. In Shuruppak, an 11-foot bed of clean clay separates two levels of occupation, devoid of pottery shards, suggesting a flood so sudden it left no trace of daily life. The dating, around 2900 BC, matches eerily with the period the Sumerians themselves called the Age of the Flood. Yet the puzzle deepens. These flood layers do not all match in time. At one site, the deluge dates to 1 century, at another to another century altogether. There was no single flood drowning all Mesopotamia. Instead, there were many catastrophic inundations of rivers that may have combined in memory to form a single, world-resetting event. For the Sumerians, the flood was more than disaster. It was a cosmic turning point. Their king list divides history into 2 eras, before the flood and after the flood. Before, kings reigned for tens of thousands of years, godlike in their longevity. After, Human lifespans contracted, mortality fixed. The flood was not just water. It was the end of one mode of existence and the fragile beginning of another. Picture the plains of southern Mesopotamia as torrents swept across them. Houses dissolved in the currents, canals became rivers, fields vanished beneath silt. Survivors clung to reed boats, watching landmarks disappear into endless water. When the waters receded, the world was blank, landmarks erased. For those who lived, it must have felt as though creation itself had been undone. Modern science suggests echoes of deeper memory. At the end of the last ice age, glacial melt raised sea levels over 400 feet. Vast tracts of land, including much of the Persian Gulf basin, disappeared beneath the rising seas. If people once lived on those lands, their displacement would have left scars in cultural memory, retold as a single flood story passed through generations. The persistence of the tale across cultures adds weight. The Hebrews told of Noah, the Greeks of Deucalion, the Hindus of Manu. Always humanity is nearly erased, preserved only by a chosen family. Always divine power resets the clock. The resonance is too strong, too widespread to dismiss as coincidence. For the Sumerians, the flood served as explanation. Why did kings no longer live for tens of thousands of years? Why did the gods feel distant now? Because time itself had been reset. The old world drowned. The new world begun. Science can measure sediment, but it cannot measure memory. The flood remains both historical and mythological, both geological and theological. It challenges us because it refuses to be one or the other, and perhaps that is the essence of Sumerian mystery. A civilization that appeared without warning, mastered writing, law, medicine, astronomy, and trade, then vanished so thoroughly it was forgotten for 4,000 years. Yet their invisible inheritance remains with us still, in our calendars, contracts, alphabets, and cities. The Sumerians did not disappear. They became the ground on which we stand. Tonight, as you listen to their stories, you are walking the invisible roads of Sumer, tracing the outlines of a civilization that continues to shape reality even in absence. Where are you listening from tonight, and at what time? And good night.